Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2. It's a challenge, Kakarot!
The following project is being presented after several revisions of well over 100 pages of information. I've worked hard on condensing all of the need-to-know information with as little fluff as possible. That being said, the information provided is likely to progress a bit faster than the average comfort zone. It's not a race. I'm simply attempting to optimize in creating a centralized source of Tenkaichi information. Such information may not strictly be based on Tenkaichi gameplay, so if you think you might learn something new, feel free to incorporate what you wish. First and foremost, I believe it is important to establish a neutral yet acceptable understanding of what makes Tenkaichi 2 work the way it does. This coincides with the idea that Tenkaichi is not like the traditional fighter, yet it may exhibit a few similarities. Many players stemming from various fight game genres have attempted to define the Tenkaichi fighting system as a Dragon Ball Z simulator. This is a misinterpretation that will only hinder your potential for technical advancement, so I recommend thinking outside of the box. During my own personal evolution as a console fighter, I've developed a new understanding of gaming factors that relate to Tenkaichi 2, we'll say more so than how they relate to the traditional fighter. Or more to the point, gaming factors that are more significant in the big picture. The idea that Tenkaichi 2 is a Dragon Ball Z simulator and not a fighting game simply limits the player's perception of technical and mechanical depth therein. There's nothing wrong with seeking a Dragon Ball Z experience in the Tenkaichi games, but through sheer definition of the simulation game, the Tenkaichi series is no more a Dragon Ball Z simulator than the Budokai series. If you want to explore and discover the depth of Tenkaichi's fighting system, you have to view it as a fighting game first. And if you can enjoy the game for the Dragon Ball Z experience, more power to you. A simulation game is a game that attempts to copy various activities from real life in the form of a game for various purposes such as training, analysis, or prediction. Usually there are no strictly defined goals in the game, with players instead allowed to freely control a character. Well-known examples are war games, business games, and role-play simulation. The purpose of Tenkaichi 2's gameplay does not relate to real-life training, analysis, or prediction. There is only one strictly defined rule: defeat your opponent through means of melee and ki-based attacks. The freedom of character control, much like any other fighting game, is limited by the laws of focal adherence. Educate yourself first. Understand what you're working with. Only then can you progress effectively in terms of reaching top-level gameplay. If you know your fighting terms, you'll be familiar with words such as spacing, zoning, stuns, footsies, priority, etc. However, as Tenkaichi 2 is a part of a gaming series that has evolved beyond the confines of the traditional style, you may hear new terms that conceptualize certain aspects of gaming factors found within Tenkaichi. The first term you'll need to become familiar with is focal adherence. Focal adherence is the representation of the mechanical laws of battle that two combatants must adhere to in relation to their focal point, being the opponent. One of the more recognizable laws included would be orientation. In the simplest explanation, orientation is what forces the opponents to face one another. All movement, defense, and attacks are directed in the opponent's position due to orientation. Not all games are constructed upon the foundation of orientation, Super Smash Bros. Melee for example. However, most fighting games are. This is why holding left will not allow Ken to turn away from the opponent, and sidestepping in Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance allows movement around the circumference of the opponent. However, it is important to note here with Mortal Kombat that the idle opponent is not forced to reposition with accordance to orientation until he executes another command, be it based on movement, defense, or offense. This goes to show that even games that contain orientation are not bound by it at all times. Understanding how focal adherence affects gameplay is one of the most important keys to excelling in combat, for this will allow you to know how your defense, offense, or overall approach can be executed and furthermore exploited. Understanding that orientation may not always present itself during combat, this will help us entertain the counter-strike concept. Counter-strikes come in different forms, depending on the game of discussion. In terms of the traditional fighter that relies on zoning and basic priority, a counter-strike may be as simple as understanding the natural reach of an opponent's attack and capitalizing with more optimal choices of attack. But if counterattacks can be considered at the basic level of two-dimensional combat, one must consider zoning's place in the 3D arena. Traditional zoning may take place in 3D combat, sure, but as the sidestep aspect of 3D fighters has been introduced, a new form of zoning has come to surface. As traditional zoning corresponds to establishing the best position for combat regarding offensive and defensive options available to both competitors, it is founded upon the two-dimensional plane of back and forth movement. Strafe zoning, on the other hand, works in a similar fashion, but uses side movement to establish optimal position for effective combat. With this new understanding of zoning tactics, counterattacks are based on new combat factors: offensive recovery time, defensive, or in this case, movement recovery time, natural reach, aggression, toggled orientation, orientation recovery time. At this point, it would be expected that you as a console combatant would understand the concepts of offensive, defensive, and movement recovery. From the instant an attack is executed to the instant a player reaches a neutral position is understood as offensive recovery time. From the instant a defensive execution is performed to the instant the player reaches a neutral position is understood as defensive recovery time. From the instant a movement is executed to the instant the player reaches a neutral position is understood as movement recovery time. In the case of strafe zoning, the movement itself is performed as a defensive tactic, so don't wear yourself out here. The natural reach of an attack is the distance of coverage relating to the specific attack without character displacement. For example, if Ryu's arm length is 2 feet and he executes a standing strong punch, his punch does not create character displacement. The natural reach of the attack is 2 feet because he did not move from his original position. If, however, Ryu executes his Tatsumaki kick that covers a distance of, say, 5 feet, this is known as the level of aggression relating to the attack. This is the amount of distance covered by the attack that also creates equal displacement. Attacks exhibiting extreme aggression are displayed as bicycle kicks, ninja slides, and even teleportation attacks. However, a single punch or kick may possess aggression if the character takes even a single step forward in doing so. If one can calculate both the natural reach and aggression of an attack, this will allow the player to react accordingly for defense and counterattack. For this reason, it is important to become familiar with all characters regarding the types of attacks they possess. Remember, while natural reach and aggression are important, speed will play a significant part in one's ability to handle defense and counter strikes. Understanding toggle orientation is the most important factor when working with basic strafe zoning. Most console fighters already comprehend this concept as it is merely another aspect of competitive gameplay. As orientation is the controlling factor that ensures all attacks are directed at the opposing player, the toggling effect is what allows an attack to be dodged via sidestep. This is due to the fact that all attacks are bound by orientation during initiation, but are released from orientation for the remainder of offensive recovery. The longer the offensive recovery, the longer it takes for orientation to be re-established. Therefore, while an attack with long natural reach and high level of aggression may be optimal in traditional zoning, an attack with high levels of aggression may require a longer recovery time, allowing a strafe zoner the advantage for punishment. Orientation recovery time would be described as the amount of time required for a character that is not facing the opponent to re-establish orientation. Such re-establishment can be obtained by executing another attack, presenting one's guard, or simply moving in any direction. However, understanding that the orientation of each attack is toggled upon execution, if the time required for orientation re-establishment is longer than the time required for toggled orientation to take place in supplementary attacks, the entirety of a combo may be toggled, presenting even longer time periods of offensive recovery. Therefore, if a combo is executed and evaded by a defending player, continuation of a combo may not result in redirection of attack, but merely extend the opportunity for counterattack. Understanding this, you as the competitor must learn exactly when toggled orientation takes place, as well as orientation reactivation relating to holding block, remaining idle, charging key, attacking, etc. And this goes for any game, not just Tenkaichi 2. Now there's also another concept that is very important to understand when regarding the punish game of Tenkaichi 2, or any other game for that matter. This concept is called channeling. Channeling is the redirection of an attack to its targeted location, be it the front of the opponent or the rear. Once an attack makes contact, the remainder of the attack may be applied to its specific position in relation to the channeling aspect of the game. For example, in Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, we have established the understanding that an idle character is not bound by orientation. Therefore, a player can reach rear positioning by simply walking around the character's circumference. However, if an attack is executed upon the rear of the opponent will immediately turn around and take the damage from the front. This is the channeling aspect of Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. No matter where the attack makes contact, the remainder of the attack will be directed to the front of the opponent. There are games, however, in which if an attack makes contact with the opponent from the back, the remainder of the attack will channel to the rear of the opponent. In this case, games such as Budokai 3 and Tenkaichi 2 have incorporated a separate damage output when regarding attacks from the front and attacks from the rear. An attack from the rear in Tenkaichi 2, for example, presents 50% more damage than attacks from the front, thus forcing a level of situational awareness when engaging the opponent. As we work around the mechanical limitations of Tenkaichi 2's system, one must consider the fact that unlike the traditional fighter that is built on a single level of focal adherence, Tenkaichi 2 is built on several. Each level is based upon the position and physical action of the player's character, and through such technical exploration, the exploitation potential of Tenkaichi 2 will introduce new levels of focal adherence. Aside from what is seen at top-level gameplay, every gaming community will have a general consensus of which combat factor contains the highest value, offense or defense. Even at top-level gameplay, some professional players will still conduct their combat with more of an aggressive offense, while others will exhibit a more controlled, defensive style. The more philosophical standpoint would be that each factor holds equal value. Please stand by for another awesome quote by General Sun Tzu. Invincibility lies in the defense, the possibility of victory in the attack. Many players simply choose to place more stock in one factor than the other. One player may possess an offensive mindset that he believes will overwhelm the opponent's defense. Another player may believe that as long as he can withstand the assault, there is no way the opponent can win. Regardless of any player's preference, to ultimately master a fighting game, one must be willing to endure the required training to master both offense and defense. It is easy for this concept to become lost on a player. When discussing the depth of a fighting game, most players choose to discuss the offensive nature of the game and disregard the defensive side. This typically happens when their game of choice does not contain a lot of defensive options, nor defensive depth. For those of you who indulge in such debates, consider the following. Offense and defense are equally important in terms of exhibiting the depth of a fighting game. If the opposing game of debate contains a single or even two methods of defense, half of the game's depth worthy of consideration may have been left out of the conversation. Now, I just talked about offense and defense as though they were the only major factors to consider in fighting games. There is one major factor that I did not include, and it's possibly the most important key to enhancing the overall metagame of a fighter. This factor is movement itself. Without movement, one's attack may not make contact with its intended target. Without movement, an attempt to evade an attack may result with taking damage. This is yet another factor to include on the debate of combat depth. Considering such terminologies, zoning, and spacing, this is a concept that any top-level player can understand and agree with. In this next episode, we will be getting started on Tenkaichi 2's basic mechanical construct and technical concepts that will allow us to excel. Until next time, this is Zero Annihilated, and you are watching Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2 Evolution.